January 17, 1943. Dawn creeps over the frostbitten fields of northern France. Low clouds cling to the horizon, heavy with moisture, as the roar of engines cuts through the icy air. A squadron of Allied bombers emerges from the mist, their dark silhouettes barely visible against the pale morning sky. The men inside grip their controls, senses sharpened, ears straining against the mechanical thunder. Every heartbeat echoes the tension. Every shadow could hide a Messerschmitt ready to strike. Flak bursts in the distance, sending sparks like frozen fire into the sky. Radio chatter is terse, clipped messages punctuated by the distant rattle of anti-aircraft guns. These are not just machines. They are lifelines, carrying crews who have learned the high cost of a single mistake. And yet, today feels different. Something in the formation, the pattern of their flight, carries an unspoken confidence, a subtle, calculated defiance. History is about to witness a small squadron challenge the rules of the skies, and in doing so, change the fate of every bomber that follows. By early 1943, the Allied strategic bombing campaign over Europe was reaching a critical phase. The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces had committed thousands of bombers to the skies, targeting factories, rail hubs, and oil refineries deep within German territory. Yet for every successful raid, losses mounted. Bomber crews faced a lethal gauntlet, flak exploding like deadly fireworks, fighters that struck from sun and cloud alike, and the ever-present risk of mechanical failure in aircraft pushed to their limits. Each mission demanded precision, courage, and endurance, but the human and mechanical toll was staggering. In the skies over occupied Europe, formations were everything. Traditional combat doctrine dictated tight, V-shaped combat boxes, designed to maximize defensive firepower and mutual protection. Bomber gunners were trained to create overlapping arcs of machine gun fire, a deadly lattice aimed at intercepting enemy fighters. On paper, the system made sense. In practice, it was brutally unforgiving. Pilots had to maintain position under immense strain, turbulence, and gunfire. A single slipper, faltering engine, a misjudged maneuver could unravel the formation, leaving the bomber exposed. The Luftwaffe had perfected their countermeasures. Jagdgeschwader fighter units patrolled known routes with ruthless efficiency, exploiting weaknesses in Allied formations. German pilots relied on speed, surprise, and coordination, striking in pairs or larger groups, then vanishing into cloud or sun. Anti-aircraft batteries along key industrial zones, flak towers, bristling with 88mm guns, added another layer of deadly unpredictability. Survival was a matter of timing, instinct, and increasingly innovation. Amid this grim landscape, bomber losses were climbing at an alarming rate. In January 1943 alone, the U.S. 8th Air Force lost nearly 10% of its heavy bombers during a single raid over Wilhelmshaven. For the crews, each mission carried the psychological weight of statistics. Officers and pilots understood that maintaining morale was as important as tactics. Fear and fatalism threatened cohesion, and in the chaos of massed bombers, hesitation could be fatal. It was into this crucible of pressure and attrition that one particular squadron would introduce a small, radical adjustment to formation flying. Their story begins not with a grand strategy board or top-level directive, but with the quiet observations of pilots and commanders, determined to keep their men alive. Small deviations, born from necessity, would soon redefine how bombers moved through hostile skies. The stage was set, the skies were deadly, the stakes impossibly high, and conventional methods had reached their limit. A change seemingly counterintuitive was about to emerge, and with it, the possibility of rewriting the rules of aerial combat. The squadron at the center of this story was a unit of the 8th Air Force, flying B-17 Flying Fortresses. Known for their resilience and professionalism, they had already endured some of the costliest missions over Germany. Each aircraft carried 10 men: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and gunners bound together by shared risk. Their lives depended on every link in the chain functioning flawlessly. One misstep, one moment of hesitation, could mean death for an entire crew. Leadership within the squadron was critical. Their commanding officer, a veteran of earlier campaigns, had grown increasingly frustrated by the relentless losses that standard formation tactics produced. He understood that morale, cohesion, and trust could not simply be mandated, they had to be earned through action and innovation. Briefings were tense affairs, filled with maps, mission reports, and statistical analyses of losses and enemy patterns. Pilots and navigators pored over charts of flak concentrations, fighter patrol zones, and previous mission outcomes. Knowledge alone was not enough. It had to be applied in the air, where wind, weather, and enemy fire could render theory meaningless. The men themselves were aware that something had to change. Fatigue, fear, and the psychological strain of repeated combat created subtle fractures in even the most disciplined units. Pilots reported anxiety in maintaining rigid formations under heavy fire. Gunners complained of blind spots and overlapping fields of fire that still left them vulnerable to coordinated enemy attacks. Even experienced crews recognized that the rules of formation flying, designed for ideal conditions, often failed under the unpredictable chaos of real combat. It was against this backdrop that small innovations began to emerge. Some pilots experimented with minor adjustments in spacing. Others altered altitude slightly to avoid overlapping trajectories of enemy fire. These tweaks were often informal, shared quietly among peers rather than ordered from command. Yet they hinted at a larger principle, that rigid adherence to doctrine might be less effective than adaptive. Situational tactics. The seeds of what would become the wrong-way formation were planted not in a strategy room, but in the minds of crews willing to challenge convention to survive. By mid-1943, the squadron had flown dozens of missions, each a test of endurance, skill, and courage. Losses had remained high, but the desire to innovate had grown stronger. Leadership was ready to support tactical experimentation, and the crews were prepared to trust in something radically different. The stage was now set for a small, daring deviation from established doctrine, and adjustment that would allow a bomber squadron to defy expectations, reduce losses, and change the way Allied air power operated over Europe. With the conditions, pressures, and human stakes established, it becomes essential to examine the multiple angles that converge to make this innovation possible. The human experience, tactical logic, leadership decisions, enemy behavior, and technological constraints. Human perspective. For the men and the bombers, fear was constant but never paralyzing. Every mission demanded both instinct and discipline, a balance between gut reaction and trained procedure. Pilots gripped controls until their knuckles whitened, scanning the skies for telltale glints of enemy fighters. Gunners rotated through positions, eyes straining against clouds and sun, scanning for fleeting movement. The psychological toll was immense. Anticipation of flak bursts, the sudden roar of approaching Messerschmitts, and the knowledge that a single hit could tear apart their fragile metal cocoon. Yet camaraderie and trust within the crew became a lifeline. Small adjustments, like shifting slightly out of sync with the formation or experimenting with flight angles, required confidence in both one's own skill and the actions of fellow airmen. This human resilience under pressure set the foundation for the squadron's eventual breakthrough. Tactical perspective. Conventional formations were designed to maximize overlapping fields of defensive fire, theoretically deterring fighters from pressing an attack. In practice, these boxers created predictable patterns. Enemy pilots had studied them, noting vulnerabilities in approach angles and blind spots. Tactical innovation emerged from a simple observation: slight deviations in flight paths, seemingly wrong, according to doctrine, could break this predictability. By experimenting with spacing, staggered altitudes, and unconventional angles, the squadron discovered that enemy attacks could be disrupted, leaving bombers less exposed. Each adjustment was minor in isolation, but collectively they created a dynamic, shifting target of formation that no longer conformed to textbook expectations. Leadership. Perspective. The squadron's commanding officer played a subtle yet decisive role. Rather than impose rigid rules, he encouraged observation, experimentation, and adaptive thinking. Debriefings were not only about what went wrong, but why it went wrong and how minor changes could improve outcomes. He recognized the limits of top-down control in aerial combat. By empowering pilots to make informed decisions mid-flight, he cultivated a culture of trust and innovation. Leadership became less about enforcing doctrine and more about creating an environment where measured risk could lead to survival. These first three angles, the human, the tactical, and the leadership, intertwined to create fertile ground for innovation. Crews who understood their own limits, commanders willing to permit deviation, and tactics that leveraged unpredictability all set the stage for the squadron to experiment boldly. Enemy perspective. The Luftwaffe pilots facing these bombers were experienced and disciplined. They had studied Allied formations extensively and relied on coordinated attacks to exploit predictable flight patterns. Yet even the most skilled pilots were challenged when confronted with sudden deviation. The wrong-way formations disrupted the rhythm they depended on, forcing split-second recalculations mid. German intelligence reports later noted the frustration of fighter units encountering squadrons that did not conform to expected patterns. This adaptability introduced confusion and hesitation, reducing the effectiveness of concentrated attacks and, crucially, giving Allied crews critical extra seconds to respond. Technological perspective. The B-17 Flying Fortress was robust but limited in speed and maneuverability. Its defensive armament, while formidable, had blind spots that enemy fighters could exploit. Navigation relied heavily on visual markers and rudimentary radio guidance, making tight formation flying essential but challenging. Any tactical adjustment had to consider these limitations. Altering formation patterns in a calculated way leveraged the aircraft's strength's long-range endurance, multiple gun positions, while minimizing exposure to its vulnerabilities. The wrong-way formation was not a gimmick. It was a methodical adaptation to the capabilities of the planes themselves. Moral and psychological perspective. repeated losses had a profound psychological impact on bomber crews. Morale wavered as men witnessed comrades fall to flak or fighters. Confidence in doctrine alone was insufficient. The introduction of a new approach, one that demonstrated tangible reduction in casualties, had a powerful effect. Belief in the formation's efficacy reinforced courage, reduced hesitation, and strengthened cohesion within the squadron. Human psychology, as much as technology or tactics, became a force multiplier. Crews flew with renewed determination, knowing that their survival was not left to chance but to a combination of skill, innovation, and collective trust. These angles in technological and moral complement the first three, creating a multidimensional understanding of why the squadron's adaptation succeeded. Human skill, adaptive leadership, tactical ingenuity, enemy response, aircraft capabilities, and psychological resilience all converged, culminating in a decisive shift in the air war. The moment of reckoning came over the Ruhr Valley in April 1943. Dawn was pale and cold, the sky low with heavy clouds. As the squadron prepared for another deep penetration raid on German industry, the mission briefing had been clear: high-altitude bombing, maintain formation, expect heavy flak. But this time, something was different. The commanding officer had approved a radical adjustment. Instead of the rigid, textbook combat box, the squadron would adopt a staggered, counterintuitive flight pattern, a wrong-way formation designed to confuse the enemy, break their attack rhythm, and minimize exposure. As the bombers climbed through the mist, the subtle adjustments were apparent to trained eyes. Wings overlapped in unusual angles. Aircraft maintained unconventional spacing, and altitude changes were staggered to prevent predictable lines of sight. To an outsider, it seemed chaotic. To the crews, it was calculated. Each pilot understood his position relative to others, and each gunner had a revised field of fire that accounted for the staggered formation. This was not improvisation. It was a carefully orchestrated deviation from doctrine, grounded in observation, experience, and tactical logic. Enemy fighters approached with the confidence of prior raids, expecting the familiar pattern. As they engaged, the effect was immediate. Attacks that would normally concentrate on a single bomber now encountered a shifting lattice of machine gun fire. Pilots found themselves navigating a maze of unpredictable trajectories, forcing them to break off or risk catastrophic losses. Anti-aircraft gunners struggled to estimate converging vectors. As the staggered planes presented a constantly changing target, the squadron's innovation turned the sky into a dynamic battlefield, where predictability, the enemy's greatest advantage, had been stripped away. By the time the formation reached the target and released their bombs, the results were clear. Bombers that would have been sitting ducks in a conventional box had survived with minimal damage. The Luftwaffe's coordinated assaults were disrupted, and the squadron began to realize that their small, deliberate deviation had a profound impact. Survival was no longer a matter of luck alone. It was a tactical advantage born of observation, courage, and innovation. The first missions had proven the concept, but the true test, the crucible of repeated enemy engagement, was still to come. The squadron would need to maintain precision under pressure, as enemy adaptation threatened to counteract their advantage. Over the following weeks, the squadron put the wrong-way formation to the ultimate test. May 1943 brought a raid on the heavily defended, industrial hub of Essen. Intelligence predicted intense fighter resistance and dense flak concentrations. The squadron approached in their unconventional pattern, each pilot precisely executing the staggered alignment. Observers on the ground later described the formation as disorienting, a shifting mass of steel that defied expectation. As the Luftwaffe scrambled their interceptors, the effect of the innovation became undeniable. Fighters that would normally dive into tight formations found themselves unable to predict bomber movements. Split-second corrections led to miscalculations, exposing attackers to concentrated defensive fire. Gunners on the B-17s, no longer constrained by overlapping fields of fire in a rigid box, had clear lines on enemy aircraft, and many Messerschmitts were repelled before reaching optimal attack positions. Flak crews faced similar frustration. The staggered formation altered trajectories and timing, meaning shells that would have detonated along predictable flight paths missed their mark. The squadron's survival rate on this mission was markedly higher than similar raids in previous months. Reports after the raid noted not only minimal losses but also a renewed confidence among crews who had once flown with fatalism in their hearts. The turning point was more than just a single raid. It was a shift in the calculus of aerial warfare. Enemy pilots began adjusting tactics, but the squadron's disciplined execution, combined with the flexibility of the wrong-way formation, maintained their advantage. Over the course of several subsequent missions, the unit went from high-risk vulnerability to a standard of comparative safety. Losses dropped dramatically, while mission effectiveness remained uncompromised. By July 1943, the wrong-way formation had become the squadron's defining tactic. Other units observed its success, and word spread through the 8th Air Force. What began as a subtle experiment had evolved into a proven method of reducing casualties and frustrating the enemy. The innovation had not only saved lives but had altered the strategic mindset of bomber crews across the theater. The impact of the wrong-way formation was immediate and measurable. Statistical reports from the 8th Air Force highlighted a sharp decline in bomber losses for the squadron. Where previous missions had seen attrition rates of 10 to 15% per sortie, missions flown under the new formation consistently reduced losses to below 5%. This improvement was not anecdotal. It was documented in mission debriefs, operational records, and after-action reports. The combination of staggered spacing, unconventional angles, and precise execution had transformed the squadron from a vulnerable unit into a model of survivability. Morale, long eroded by repeated casualties, began to recover. Pilots and crew members reported a renewed sense of confidence and purpose. Letters sent home described an environment where survival was plausible, and where careful strategy could tip the odds in favor of the bomber rather than the fighter. The psychological shift was profound. No longer were crews entering missions with a sense of inevitability regarding loss. Instead, they trusted in their training, their commander's judgment, and their innovative formation. The Luftwaffe took notice. Intelligence summaries from German units cited the difficulty of engaging squadrons flying non-standard formations. Fighter pilots found their usual attack patterns disrupted, forcing rapid adjustments and increasing risk during engagement. Flak units, previously able to rely on predictable flight paths, struggled to anticipate staggered bombers. The adaptation had a cascading effect, complicating enemy planning and giving the Allies a tactical edge beyond a single squadron. Beyond the immediate tactical gains, the squadron's innovation inspired broader consideration within the Allied command. Air officers and operational planners began evaluating formation flexibility as a legitimate method of reducing losses, rather than strictly adhering to rigid doctrine. The lessons drawn from these missions would resonate in planning sessions, training programs, and subsequent campaigns. The success of one squadron had become a case study in the power of human ingenuity under fire. As the summer of 1943 progressed, the effects of the wrong-way formation extended beyond a single squadron. Other bomber units observed the reduced losses and increased mission effectiveness and began experimenting with similar tactical bulletins circulated throughout the 8th Air Force, highlighting the principles behind staggered formations and the benefits of calculated unpredictability. This represented a subtle but meaningful shift in Allied air doctrine. Flexibility and adaptability were now recognized as critical complements to firepower in numbers. Operational records confirm that squadrons adopting these methods experienced significant survival improvements, casualty rates fell, mission success rates climbed, and crews reported higher confidence in facing enemy opposition. The innovation had altered the psychological environment of the air war. Fear was mitigated not by luck, but by tactical skill and disciplined execution. Commanders noted that airmen who trusted their formations were more effective under fire, coordinating attacks and defensive maneuvers with precision. Strategically, the impact was also felt by the Luftwaffe. German intelligence increasingly recorded Allied formations that defied prediction, forcing fighter units to adopt more cautious tactics. The Luftwaffe's once lethal advantage in aerial interception was incrementally eroded. While the war was far from decided, the experiences of one squadron demonstrated that adaptation and observation could alter the balance between attacker and defender. The broader significance extended beyond statistics and morale. This tactical innovation exemplified the importance of initiative and adaptability in wartime. Small decisions by observant pilots, supported by flexible leadership, could ripple outward to influence entire campaigns. The squadron's success became a benchmark in air operations training, demonstrating that ingenuity and courage could save lives and reshape strategy. The story of this bomber squadron is more than a tale of tactics. It is a testament to human ingenuity under pressure. In the cold, hostile skies over Germany, where every mission carried the weight of life and death, a subtle deviation or wrong-way formation transformed vulnerability into resilience. It was neither a grand invention nor a directive from high command, but a practical adaptation born from observation, experience, and trust. Small adjustments, calculated risk, and disciplined execution became forces capable of challenging the deadliest threats of the era. The squadron's success underscores a timeless lesson. Rigid adherence to doctrine cannot replace critical thinking in the face of evolving challenges. War is chaotic, unpredictable, and unforgiving. Yet within that chaos, human creativity can alter outcomes, preserve lives, and redefine strategy. The men in those bombers, pilots, gunners, navigators demonstrated that courage is not only measured by facing fire, but also by the willingness to question, innovate, and act decisively. In historical terms, the wrong-way formation left a quiet but enduring legacy. It influenced Allied air tactics, contributed to the evolving doctrine of flexibility in formation flying, and became a case study in the power of initiative. More importantly, it offers a human perspective, even amid the immense machinery of war. Individual insight and collective trust can shift the balance between survival and loss. That is, the engines faded into memory and the skies cleared. The lesson remained. Innovation is not always found in new machines or weapons. It is found in the minds of those who refuse to accept inevitability, who dare to think differently, and who place ingenuity alongside courage as a weapon in itself. In the frozen dawns and perilous altitudes of 1943, one squadron proved that survival, strategy, and human will can converge to change the course of history.